What's up, YouTube? It's your boy again. This is Low Tier. Anyway, I'm going to be doing my video on fighting game meta dynamics and transitioning between games and stuff like that. So, just a bit of kind of a background. I had this as my sub goal for my Twitch, and I really wanted to talk about this. So, bear with me. If I really wanted to talk about it, it means it's pretty long and grueling and complex. But I think, there's a bit of this to hear for everyone. I mainly feel like this topic is kind of catered to more experienced fighting game players who have maybe played multiple games before, but as for newer players, it's definitely helpful to understand these things if you're going to go between games or, obviously if you're in the scene, you might end up playing another game, so. Let me just get right into it. So, my topics are kind of focused on the two ideas of establishment and application. And, those terms are kind of vague, but I generally like to say that there are games that are focused on establishment and games that are focused on application, right? And it's not so binary, of course, because there's kind of varying degrees, and I think BB Tag's a great example. So, what does that mean? How do we even, make this distinction that a game is about application or establishment? Well, it's all about the risk-reward development of the game and how it actually affects the play experience of the game, right? So, if I wanted to put it simply, it would be, how do I most effectively win, right? What do I focus on so that I can most effectively win? And I think that we can kind of group games into establishment and application-focused games and stuff like that. So I think BB Tag is a really funny example because a majority of the game is focused on things from an application standpoint. But obviously, when you have one character left, right, it becomes a bit more about establishment and kind of like playing your solo neutral game and stuff like that. So obviously this is not the case for all the characters, but especially for a character like Hyde or Blake, it is very oriented around a traditional fighting game style, which is sort of the establishment style of a fighting game. So sorry, it's definitely confusing because I'm just using these terms and you're like, but what do they mean? Right? So let me explain. So I have my little bullet points here in my notebook for what is the mark of an establishment focused game. So I'm going to run down the two kind of bullet points and then I'll talk about the games in particular. I wanted to give examples about BBCF as an establishment-focused game, Granblue as an establishment-focused game, and BB Tag as an application-focused game, right? And why this is important at all is because, as I said before, when players are looking to transition between new games, you don't want to approach a game the wrong way. Because if you play a game the same way that you've played another game you've played, maybe it'll work out, but you're not really tailoring yourself to that game. You're not really tailoring yourself to the kind of demands that the game requires of you and what the game actually wants you to do to succeed in the game, right? So identifying those goals and making it very explicit and having you think about these things is obviously instrumental to success in competing, blah, blah, blah. Whatever, if you just want to impress your girls, I don't care. So let me just get down with it. What is the mark of an establishment-focused game? So your strong approach tools or neutral options rarely directly transition into a winning scenario, be it through options or risk-reward from those neutral tools, right? So what that means is even if a tool can transition into a winning scenario, it is a high-risk, high-reward tool, right? So as a kind of explanation of this point, things are very low reward or very medium risk, medium reward. So there's a kind of trend of relatively muted risk reward relation, right? It's pretty evened out. There's a major emphasis on subverting expectation to utilize tools properly, right? Strength comes from the conjunction of options, thus establishment, right? So strength, let's use Blake as an example. Let's imagine that she's alone. So imagine if Blake had a very strong neutral tool that looks like this, and she does. It's 5B, right? So imagine if establishing 5B was how you win the game, right? Surely it is like this in kind of solo situations, but we could talk about the girl right here. Let me go back to it. Oh no. Here we go. I found it. Cool. This girl, who has very similar normals to... Oh, this girl. Oh, I'm circling her. She has very similar normals to Blake, but think about how she establishes threat at neutral, right? She's using these far-range whip tools, and they don't necessarily convert into a bajillion damage, or give her this scenario, right? Where she's in and she's pressuring you, right? But she has to use these tools to actually create the framework for her to approach and stuff like that. And her successful use of those far-range tools themselves directly do not give her a ton of damage or a strong setup. They just give her that enforcement of the situation. So establishing those things are more important than the literal application of those things, which is where the terminology I'm using comes from, right? So we can look at solo Blake. She's kind of built around establishing this advantage range so that she can either navigate neutral more safely or, you know, take advantage and go in and, you know, go crazy if she wants to, like, mix you up and all that stuff, right? But the general idea is still there, and she's a 14k health character, right? I wonder why she has 14k health, because she can do stuff like this. So, anyway, on to the next point. So, landing on the last thing that I mentioned, which was major emphasis on subverting expectation. So this takes the form of implicit threat in neutral due to an independently unstable risk-reward that you can rely on. More options have reasonable counters or low reward, creating an onus on the player to function more directly in responses, as well as establishing a strong presence to take advantage of, right? So we just saw it with Blake, right? Implicit threat in neutral, especially solo. If you're standing at this range, you're scared of this, right? And it's not because she can kill you off of it, it's because it's a strong option, right? But if she could kill you off of it, it'd be kind of skewed. She'd be like hunting you down, right? And then she would do it. But instead she's using it to control space. Why? It's because it doesn't kill you, right? It doesn't kill you. But if you're with a teammate, this kills you, right? This kills you. So that's BB tag, though, right? So anyway, I hope that kind of explanation on implicit threat was pretty efficient, because honestly, right, in using this tool, your success doesn't come from hitting them with it, right? Well, it could, but they're not really going to get hit with it a lot. It's not a mix-up, really. But taking advantage of it is what it's going to help you win the match. So anyway, moving on. What is the mark of an application-based game? Strong options by nature or virtue of risk-reward that oftentimes directly translate into a winning scenario, right? So one of the great things that I like to talk about is Super Dash, right? So let's imagine Blake doing Super Dash. This. Yeah, that's Super Dash, right? So Super Dash directly translates into a winning scenario. Here, get mixed. Right? Our Super Dash costs us high-low with Air Dash. It has counters, though, right? But the tool is so important to use, and kind of literally pressing the button for Super Dash is so important in establishing your kind of presence, that sometimes just doing super dash and being right with it can win you the match, right? So that kind of goes on into the other points, so I'll just finish reading. So for application-based games, offense is generally strong or difficult to respond to in a meaningful way. A lot of emphasis on a definable goal, right? So our definable goal in BB Tag is the sandwich, right? Or our definable goal in Dragon Ball might be to like jail you in block stun and run high-low if you can, right? If you can. But overall, the offense is so strong in this game that stuff like this. Here, let me do a. Here we go, right? So we've got push block, right? Push block doesn't really negate these scenarios once you're sandwiched. So once you've established the sandwich already, it's actually very hard to deal with, right? Even if you push block, even if you blah blah blah, look at this. What am I supposed to do? It's a strong situation, right? And strong situations existing in that capacity is like pretty defining, I'd say, right? So you want to talk about Vanilla BlazBlue, where there are characters like Valkenhayn and blah blah blah, but there are a lot of defensive options in that game that are very rewarding, right? So Valkenhayn can't block. You have barrier, and you have instant barrier, and you have like DPRC, and you have overdrive, right? You have so many defensive options in that game compared to this one that the general offensive scenarios that you go for are just so much more feasibly stable, right? So even in an extreme case like Valkenhayn, it is not nearly as extreme as the success rate of offense in this game. So, next point. There's a lot of active space control in neutral built around literally performing certain options. The win condition and control options are sometimes one in the same, much more closely defined around identifying reward and derivative reward, right? So we can look at Fairy, where what Fairy does in neutral, right, is not directly correlated to reward, right? Her point in controlling space is to literally control space. It is not to necessarily kill you and win the game, right? So these concepts will all kind of tie themselves together in a way more, I feel this way when you're actually playing these games and thinking about these things. So, right, Fairy is not winning off slapping you with her little whip. She will win off slapping you with her little whip 15 times, 16 times, but that's not her win condition. If she gets a clean hit like a sweep, which is at a close range, right, then she can actually transition into her mix-ups and stuff like that. But overall, she's great for displaying these concepts. So I can talk more about Granblue in specific about why that game is based on establishment and how to effectively translate your skills into that game, but that'll come after I finish talking about the two game styles, right? Which I almost did. So overall, what is the mark of an application-based game is an extremely high risk for, high reward for picking singular options. Sometimes playing a rock can win the match for you, thus the focus, right? Sometimes doing this can win the match for you, so it is very important that you literally do it, right? That you literally press the button and do it instead of making them scared that you're going to do it. So sometimes playing a rock is more important than saying, I can play rock, if that makes sense, right? So a lot of these games, especially in a game like BB Tag, there's a lot of active space control. You're throwing this out, controlling options and stuff like that, right? You're not really threatening them. You're literally doing it, right? So there are different angles of games to consider, but how you kind of want to approach a game is pretty important. If you were like a Street Fighter player and you came into this game and you were like, I'm going to play neutral like this. I'm going to sit here, right? I'm going to sit back while Blake does this and puts me in a terrible situation. No, you can't, because you'll lose. You'll lose. It's It's not as important, right? And that's kind of what I meant to talk about. It is not as important to focus on certain things in certain games. Wow, what a revelation. But, you know, it's always nice to talk about things explicitly. So, BB Tag, as an application-focused game, I kind of want to talk about it in the way where, like, we can talk about all these concepts, right? Strong options by nature or virtue of risk-reward, right? So, maybe this has counters, but it can get me a win condition, right? And I have a definable goal, which is this positioning that I'm really aiming for, right? And you mitigating that positioning is really important for you to stay alive, right? So a lot of my active space control and threat that people may play around is at this range, right? So me taking advantage of that, obviously I have to take in the angle of establishment to a degree. Because if they're scared of this, then I can do this, right? But that's the kind of derivative reward and strategy that I was kind of talking about, because a lot of emphasis comes from developing those situations. Dragon Ball is a very similar game in that regard, where you can kind of build options around stuff like, you know, if they're gonna sit on the ground to react to my super dash, how do I take advantage of this, right? And there are ways that you can do that for a very similar reward, but it is so inherently constraining, right? Because if they want to anti-air my super dash, they have to sit there. Some characters, which are very strong for the reason that they can air-to-air super dash, are strong, right? Because they don't really have to necessarily engage in that control that you're, you know, putting on them. But it's a pretty important point to think about, especially thinking about where you want to focus your efforts while you're playing the games and stuff. So I'll just give a quick example of how I would be thinking about an application-focused game versus how I'd be thinking about an establishment-focused game, right? So let's say I'm a new player and I'm looking to play Blake Hyde, and, you know, I watch some of SKD's videos and I have no idea why he's doing what he's doing. But he's doing this a lot, right? He's doing this thing, and, you know, I see how he could win from this, but sometimes I do it and then they jump and they're over here, right? So he does it and then, okay, I accidentally still get them, but I still throw out the option here, right? Well, I'm not really in such a bad scenario because, you know, I throw this out, maybe they jump back and they call their assist too, but if I take the initiative, I'm very safe here, and I kind of, you know, I made the move towards the corner, like, not bad. I can actually hit their assist too. This is pretty good, right? So forcing my opponent to play around this is actually very important in the same way that it is an establishment-oriented game, but literally doing this is more important in the first place, right? And that's what I'm talking about. So we're thinking about angles like this. We're thinking about angles about abusing responses to strong options. And ultimately, that's where a lot of success in this game comes from. Defining those, like, next step, next step, next step. My offense is strong. You've got a lot of strong risk-reward options overall that have very skewed potential, right? Because once you get this, it's time, baby. Like, it's time, baby. Like, here, hold the mix, you know? But how do I do this in a game like Grand Blue or in a game like BBCF, right? So I would love to switch over to BBCF, but I'm going to go to Grand Blue right now. So we'll talk about this, right? Look at that. I can't get confirms off of these normals. I'm not really confirming them into, like, big damage or whatever. See, I'm guessing with sweep there because it gives a high reward comparatively, but sweep is not really a huge aspect of space control, right? And even talking less about space control, if we want to talk about the cool thing like frame traps, right? There's a good one here. What do we got? Oh, this is not the first round. First round, right here. Look at Fairy's nice flip. Cool. So look at this. Watch this. Let's look at my potential options in this scenario, right? This song is so calming. I needed it for this video. So I've got a nice run in here, very brave. I do 5A. What are my options, right? What are my options? I could press my advantage here. I can try to use Gigi, cancel, to get a huge amount of frame advantage if he sits there and respects, right? And that's my winning condition almost, right? That is my closest thing to a definable goal that will help me win the match, even though it's not necessarily the safest thing to go for me because he can mash me out, right? And as a result, my brain is like, here, I'm gonna frame trap because I don't think that I'm safe enough. I haven't established myself well enough, right? So I do my frame trap, and it actually lands, right? Because he was trying to do something after the 5A. What could I have done after the 5A? It's very constrained. I only have unique action to cancel into. I only have DP to cancel into, which is I'm not going to do. There is EX or normal 236A, which doesn't give me any frame advantage, but does catch a frame trap. But at this range, oh, it does catch a frame trap. It does function as a frame trap. At this range, this also functions as a frame trap and is safer on block, right? So I go for this, and it actually lands, right? So look at my reward for being right. That was literally the best thing I could have gotten in that scenario. That was literally the best thing I could have gotten in that scenario. I did, like, not even 10%, right? And imagine if I frame trapped someone in BB tag. How bad could it be? How bad could it be? Right? You take a full confirm. Your opponent gets to feel themselves styling on you, right? Like, imagine that, right? So actually, the defensive option relative in risk reward, even though it was literally the same thing, a frame trap, right? In responding to it, even at this range, it's completely different in terms of conversion ability and in terms of like threat instilled and what happens if he blocks it, right? I'm -3 in Grand Blue, that is. I'm -3. What happens if it gets blocked, right? But what happens if this gets blocked? It doesn't matter. I don't care. I got more where that came from, right? So thinking about the derivative risk reward in this game is like so important for actually making these guesses, right? But in a game like Grand Blue, it's more important that you're actually just saying, hey, don't do this. Hey, you know. So we can go back to the Grand Blue match. Right? Literally just enforced. Right? Literally just enforced. The only reason why I got away with that geeky call was because I literally just did a frame trap with a special move from there. And now we've got a very threatening situation, and I don't convert this into a ton of damage, but it is another knockdown, and I'm in safely, right? So this is honestly awesome, right? A lot of my reward here, all these successful hits that I just got, came from making him expect something else, and then doing something else, right? And it is the overall total of options that makes these scenarios strong, rather than the independent strength of options like in this game, where maybe I only have like 2 or 3 ways to interact with you in neutral at this angle, or at this spacing, but they're all really good, right? They're all really good. They're all really threatening, so literally using them is a lot more important than actually being like, hey, I could do it, but I'm not going to do it, right? So that's kind of what I mean in terms of implicit threat neutral. I hope that example was good enough. Honestly, I think it's a really important topic, and The couple of examples that I gave about Granblue, I think actually really lend to the kind of style of game that it will be, right? And I'm sorry that my room's a mess. My girlfriend's like a whirlwind. She just comes, right? But pretty much in transitioning and getting ready for a game like Granblue, we want to think about how to approach that game and how the tools work in terms of risk reward to help identify like how we're going to actually even approach it in the first place, right? So, you know, a lot of people were asking me like, how'd you get so solid at Granblue at like, you know, hour 10, right? It's because I identified the goals in the game's tools, right? The risk reward that the tools actually allow, the constraints of the options that the games give you, and stuff like that. They really create this kind of overarching scenario where it is more important that you threaten people with options rather than actually using them, right? So I really, honestly, I will say I prefer that kind of game. I like games like BBCF. I like games like Granblue, and they're both really different in the way that like Granblue you get kind of so here we go, right? Granblue is kind of medium to low risk, medium to low reward on your far range pokes, right? But in BlazBlue, you can get whiff punished so easily for 5 bajillion damage that the implicit threat in neutral comes from a different place, right? So even though these are both establishment-oriented games, we could see that BlazBlue's establishment-oriented dynamic comes from the high-risk, high-reward of a lot of neutral pokes, right? And a lot of neutral movements. And then it takes the form of a very like implicit threat neutral game versus Granblue, where it is low to kind of medium reward, low to medium risk, but doing these things won't win you the match, right? Just like stably relying on high risk, high reward will probably not win you the match if they're very even reward levels, right? So I hope that was kind of a good enough explanation of the dynamics. It's very complicated stuff, and the only way that I can kind of say that I think that you'll like more closely understand this is to play different games at a high level. And you know, we can talk about like tag games and like normal fighting games, but I'm sure you felt it before too, right? You've played different games and you're like, I can't play this game the same way as my other game, right? Because the games are different. So we gotta understand that. But for all the people who are looking to move on to Granblue, keep that in mind. The game seems like it's structured around that kind of mentality, and I'm definitely looking forward to that a lot. So yeah, they're the two buzzwords of the hour: establishment versus application. So enjoy. I hope you learned something. I hope my examples, you know, helped at all. But yep, I'll see you around.